Hello and welcome to 1 Week Critiques interview series. We are interviewing Ingrid Wenzler this week for episode 11. Ingrid is one of our editors at 1 Week Critique. She is generally our fiction slash prose editor. She also writes prose herself very well, I might add. Ingrid, what else would you like to let people know you're interested in? What else do you do?
Well, first, Matthew, thanks for having me. And viewers should basically just know that I'm glad they're here spending time with us.
All right, excellent. So today we're going to look at one of Ingrid's stories, and we're going to ask her to read the first draft. So I'm going to refer to this as number 89 East 42nd Street because that is what the final version of the story is called. The first version is actually entitled A Sparrow, and Ingrid is going to read the first 3 paragraphs of the story, and then she will probably give you a quick summary of what the rest of the story is, so that you're aware and we're not going over time for the reading of the story. So let me bring that up on the screen here. And whenever you're ready, Ingrid.
A Sparrow. In Grand Central Terminal in December of 1941, a local train pulled into track 7. The passengers got off, then either walked toward the lower concourse or a narrow back staircase. One passenger was a young Japanese man who walked with his 2 hands held behind his back and with his back straight. He was called Akira. It was cold and he wore a thin coat over his suit but no gloves. He felt tired and he blinked as though to pull himself out of it. It was no more than 5:30, but he was in a hurry. As the crowd he was with came to where the track ended, where the lower concourse was, he looked straight ahead of him, but he didn't seem to see anything. He couldn't have told you what he had seen. He was thinking of the broadcasts. Been going on for almost 3 hours. A bomb dropped. Severe bombing, severe bombing. All the announcers had said that. They kept saying that. Then there was another line. He tried to hold on to it then, as he had heard it. It was bombing by enemy planes, Japanese planes. No, undoubtedly Japanese it was. Undoubtedly Japanese. Those words, they seemed to peel. He'd understood the inevitability of war and what the scale of the war would be, as they all had, all Americans, all Japanese. And he'd known that America could not stay out of it, but he did not think, he could not have thought that his country would be the country to begin it. He'd not thought about who would begin it or how America would be drawn in. But if someone had asked if the Imperial Army would attack America, his answer would have been no, that could not be, no. And then afterward, after the broadcast, no, that cannot be. It's a lie, or it's not the truth.
Thank you. So could you just do a quick walkthrough of some of the main points of the rest of the story?
Sure. So it's the story of a character's morning commute, but the morning is the morning after Pearl Harbor was bombed in December 1941. The main character, the character we follow, is a young Japanese man in New York for his medical residency. He's unaware that Japanese immigrants have been asked to stay home that day, but he's not unaware of how he'll be seen by Americans as he commutes. He's really anxious. And instead of hurrying to work and rushing through Grand Central, as he sort of planned to do, he does something unusual. And the story's about that.
Right. So I feel like the early version of this story focuses on Akira's mental state, um, particularly what has been said and reported about uh, the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor, as you said.
Mhm.
In the later version, I feel like the interiority is somewhat lessened. Could you talk about why this choice was made and how you see interiority and action working together in fiction?
Yeah, that's such an insightful question. So one thing I want to add, because for a long time I was thinking of myself as a writer, but I didn't know many terms in writing. For those of you who don't know, interiority refers to the inner world of characters, their thoughts, their reflections. Um, and you're absolutely right. The early version of this story is so much, the interiority is really fronted in it. Um, and I've been rereading this book I really love by W.G. Sebald recently, The Emigrants. And I recently also have revisited an interview of his that I really love. And I think he talks really wonderfully about interiority and the difficulties of writing about interiority, especially in relation to something like the bombing of Pearl Harbor or the Holocaust in his case. Um, he says of his own practice that what he does is he tries to convince readers first that his narrator has a conscience, and second, that there's something on his character's mind because of the difficulty of talking about something like the Holocaust so directly. He even says this thing that I really love. He says he doesn't feel like you can roll it out on every page. His approach becomes like a little more oblique. Um, And I think that's what I started to do intuitively working on this story over a long time. Um, I, I really don't think there's anything wrong with fronting interiority. And I think the balance of interiority and action really depends on the individual story. There are people who, there are writers who front interiority and do a wonderful job of it. I can think of Dostoevsky and Notes from Underground is, a great example of aggressive interiority. But in this story, just because of what I was looking to do in particular, I did start to lessen the interiority over time and to push action to the front and kind of balance the two.
Yeah, I think, that's it's really interesting to think about all of these small changes that take place between stories. And so my next question is similar in certain ways. Um, I feel like in the first draft, you uh, remove, like the first draft, you name Pearl Harbor, um, and uh, you remove that overt naming of the event in the latter version. Um, right. And so, in lieu of focusing on how Akira feels and what he notices to provide setting and circumstances, um, on the other hand, Akira has a last name in the later draft. Plus, we've got constellations on the ceiling that are named in Grand Central. We've got the time markers of train butchers, of red caps that are inserted. In what ways does naming play an important part of your process in moving from draft to draft? And if naming draws readerly attention to important nouns, how do you decide what deserves a proper name?
That's another really astute question, I think. And, one that makes me feel really seen from draft to draft, because that was very much, a change that I notice as well. So my relationship to naming is complicated. Um, I think thinking about going back to what I just said about Sebald, I think if you do decide not to address, in his case, the Holocaust directly, or in my case, the Pearl Harbor bombing directly, you have to clue readers into what's going on somehow. So, I think other proper nouns do enter in for that reason. Although I think in terms of naming, there's also the question of aesthetics, and actually that I think has much more to do with the kind of change I ended up making over time. So in high school and in college, I really admired Hemingway. I still really admire Hemingway. And I think in the early draft, you really see that admiration come through. Hemingway, certainly does name his characters and names things sometimes, but he's really careful about that naming. He says the leaves on the tree, he'll often just say the tree. He won't say an oak tree or anything in particular. And I mean, I think he achieves this really beautiful universal effect as a result. He at once manages to situate you in a very particular space, in a very particular time, to convey feelings that are moving whoever you are years later. But he doesn't always do that through specificity, and he's really careful about it. And he has a certain sense of poetics about his stories as well. So that was something I was really in conversation with early on. I was modeling myself after him and, trying to do something a little more like that. I think as I started reading more widely, I developed a new sense of possibility. And I realized that I had some other goals with regard to this story, and that the naming could at once, be in line with that same sense of poetics, which I wanted to keep, but that I could achieve that poetics through specificity. So that's where that change came from.
Yeah, I mean, I think whenever I read a piece of yours, it seems very poetic.
Thank you.
And, as you know, my, I guess, main genre is poetry. And so one of the things that I think about in any milieu is repetition. Uh,
Mm.
I say that I mention poetry because, it's such a short page, um, or it's a shorter condensed story, so to speak, or space of time that repetition, when it's used um, or not used, it's an important choice. But I feel like that's also true in prose. So I'm always noticing the different types of repetition. And I think your early draft tends to repeat itself. For example, it says, quote, made him think of what would last, and it seemed to him it would last, the ceiling would last. This prosy repetition is eschewed in the later draft, yet it's spotlighted in a different way. For example, quote, he always used the same staircases, the same entrances. Here, if one day bore no resemblance to another, you were a foreign doctor, end quote. What process did you go through to change the formulation of the prose over time? And how do you see repetition operating in various forms in prose?
Another good question, Matthew. So my parents were, generally speaking, Christmas and Easter Catholics. They did want me to get confirmed. And when I was in elementary school, we went to church more. And, it was in church that I first encountered repetition that I really liked. I paid a lot of attention to the way particular biblical stories would repeat themselves, and I liked it so much. Hemingway also repeats himself a great deal, doesn't mind doing it. And I think as a young writer, I was really unafraid of repetition. I didn't really know that other writers had a problem with it. I liked it so much that I was sort of unaware of it as a mannerism. It was a kind of stylistic tick for me. And I mean, I think in the early version of this story, I use repetition in conjunction with interiority quite a bit. It's a way to capture the sound of thoughts. Um, in the later version of this story, I'm more aware of repetition and how often I use it. And I'm checking myself a little bit and making sure that it makes sense. Um, and what I find is that I end up using repetition more in more to convey the sort of rituals and routines that are really important to the main character. So it's less about the rhythm of thought and less about rhythm in general, actually, in this version, and much more about sort of capturing, yes, that routine.
Well, and to be fair, like the first drafts of this story took place in roughly 2007 to 2009. And now here we are in 2020. So, right,
Mm.
clearly, you've had time to think about prose for many a year over that span. Um, and the funny thing or the cool thing to me is that I don't necessarily think one of those is a lesser use of repetition. You know what I mean?
No, neither do I. I think important to be aware of when you're repeating, but um, no, certainly not. I agree.
So the later draft also extends the amount of time in the life, so to speak, of Akira. Not only do we know, how much time he spent in New York, we also know he is an avid watcher of his surroundings. Right, we've got the fact that he likes Grand Central Station. He's seen the man with the Studebaker that appears in the second version of the story, and he's seen this person before. Furthermore, we linger past the moment of the sparrow's freedom and join Akira to imagine or actually see this sparrow fly down the street. How do you go about expanding a character's time frame? And where do you draw a line in fiction of how much information to provide or the length of experiential material a given character is given? And how do you make these choices?
Um, Such a good question that it stumps me a little. It's hard. I think the answer for me is really sort of a frustratingly simple one, and it's just that I take my time. I try different things, and I try to see what sticks. Sometimes I'll find that expanding a character's time frame has more to do with, a backstory that I'm desperately trying to convey, and that really just ends up bogging the reader down and taking away from a sort of minimal feel that I'm trying to achieve. Um, I think what I try to do is to let myself try everything in drafts. And sometimes I'll revise sort of compulsively after I've tried something new. I really want to make the thing work. But usually what works better for me is to sit with something for a while, come back to it, in a few months and see, like, do I still like this? Is it working? And that's how I decide.
A straight meta answer from the fiction writer. Time for time, right?
Mm.
The longer time frame, the more time you take. Okay, I'm giving you a hard time. Um, I think it's interesting, though, trying to figure this out, as a writer in general, because you'll show your piece to friends and they'll offer suggestions, and some people are like, well, focus on this, and some people are like, add this or take this out. And so it always seems to be one of these big questions um, of how do I create the best possible space for a reader to come in, understand this character, and what is driving their person in the story, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, I often write short stories that are kind of like a day in the life. They literally just kind of move through a character's routine in a very straightforward way, kind of like, you know, a novel like Mrs. Dalloway works. Um, the more backstory you introduce in that framework, the more complicated the story becomes. And, I mean, I think it's really about managing what information readers need to know, and I mean, how to skillfully do that in a way that doesn't disrupt the kind of action that you're trying to achieve as well.
Speaking of action, let us get back to some action here. Uh,
Okay.
we'll ask you to read the first three paragraphs of the latter version of this piece so readers can see some of the changes that have taken place. And we'll bring it up here whenever you're ready.
A dark, foggy morning in early December. A local commuter train stood waiting at the Scarsdale station for new passengers to board. The platform wasn't especially crowded. It was early for that, but it took a while to get everyone loaded anyway. Inside the train, Akira Kono, a second-year resident at Cornell Medical Center, was reading a study in an American scientific journal. He'd read the study before and now was reading it again, trying to prepare for work. Though what he wanted most right then was to look out the window. It had become habit to listen while he read every morning, to other passengers as they looked for seats, to the train butcher hawking newspapers, magazines, tobacco. Akira would listen until he couldn't anymore, until he gave in, shut whatever he'd been reading, and turned to the window. This morning was no different. After the train stopped and loaded up at 2 more stations, Akira put the journal away. He let the fog lift. He let the train gather speed. Then he shut out all the conversation around him and noticed in an apartment across from the train, pink bed sheets being used instead of curtains. Something American, he thought. He looked down below and watched a young woman chasing after a bus, a corner grocer taking packages from the trunk of his Studebaker Commander. He'd seen the man with his new Studebaker before. He'd been in the United States for over a month and a year, and he wanted to commit his experiences to memory in case he couldn't stay.
Yeah, those are so cool. The part about the pink bed sheets that Akira thinks something American, particularly in this story where he's thinking about, you know, uh, how he's being seen on this day right after the bombings of Pearl Harbor, I think is really a great detail. Um, as you said recently, you enjoy, writing these a day in the life pieces. What do you think draws you to want to create these intimate portraits that have relatively few scenes, but like, whenever I go back and read an Ingrid Wenzler story, I always find something that I missed the first time. Like the layering is lush and deeper every time I go back to it. So, like, what really drives you to these types of portraits?
Well, first, thank you. That's kind. Um, what draws me to short fiction, especially, is that it's what I most like to read. And I've really come to writing through reading. Um, I'll encounter stories like Hemingway's, like Heinrich Boole's, like Chekhov's, like Molly Antipol's, just to give you a really eclectic list. Um, and, I'll want to do something like that. I'll also want to do something totally new. And I guess as a writer, I just feel most at home writing short fiction. Really like doing it. And yeah. I know there's less of a market for it, but I can't convince myself to care too much about that. And yeah.
Yeah, well, it'd be nice if there was no market to have to think about and just like write the story for the story's sake. But I mean, I don't know. I think some people do that, and I think that's awesome. Of course, I also know that in that situation, I probably will never see that story, and that makes me sad. Um, so it'd be great if we could find a nice little balance here. But hey, uh, I'll get off my soapbox here.
Yeah.
Um, Another thing that I find you really focus on in your work is setting and time period. They seem to be very important things. And so I'm assuming it takes a lot of research to really get the small details right and accurate. How do you think research affects your style in stories?
Good question. This is actually the first story that I did substantial research for. So I was really new to it, and before going to grad school, I found a book called Grand Central that was published in 1946, which did some of my work for me research-wise, because early on, I especially had a lot of questions about what Grand Central actually would have looked like. Um, I what would the ceiling have looked like? Would it have been the same? What kind of train would you have taken there? Would the doors have been the same? Like, had it changed architecturally? And the book I found turns out to be this really eclectic history. It's narrated by a fictional character, but has a ton of information about Grand Central in 1946. So not 1941, but kind of close enough that I was able to get a good sense of things like, the train butchers come from that language, the red caps, who are people who would have been taking people's bags in uniforms, things I just had no access to independently. Um, my research has, developed over time as well. Our other one-week critique editor, Adam Sergeni, took me to the library after graduating grad school, after leaving Arizona, and he showed me how to use microfiche, which I'd never done before. And I was able to look at newspapers from the time, and I learned a lot that way too. I would say most significant, I learned about the kind of language the papers were using at the time, about Japanese Americans, Japanese people in America, about the war as it was happening in Europe and how America was relating to that. I also learned that the Japanese had been ordered, or not ordered, but told that they ought to stay home that day, which ended up changing the plot of the story a little bit. But also small details came in, like I understood what kind of coats people would have been wearing at the time. I understood what kind of cars they would be driving. I understood like a little something about the way newspapers were already advertising for Christmas, which was something I wasn't really thinking about. So research has definitely deepened this story in particular. I don't do research for every story I write. And I'm pretty careful about it. I'm curious always to know what a story's full circumstances, but I think those curious about Grand Central at the time can just read this David Marshall book or another book. Stories aren't supposed to be informational per se.
All right, so I'm going to ask you to be honest here. How many drafts do you think you've written of this story? And I say be honest because I feel like one of the things that you do is you get so deep into the stories, much as your answer to research shows. You get really involved and inside the stories and seem to work towards a sort of perfection. And I'm making all of this like this is my projection on how I see things, just to
Mhm.
be clear. Um, but how many drafts did you go through?
The honest answer is so many I couldn't count. I know there are writers who will always print out a draft when they're finished, or who have systems where they're really itemizing each draft. Um, because I mainly work on the computer, that's not always, I don't have a way of counting, but I would say, if I had to guess, upwards of 100, upwards of 200 probably. I started this story 13 years ago when I was in college, and I've probably changed it in some way every year since then. Sometimes just in very little ways at a constant, sometimes in major ways. But I mean, I think especially for a program like this one, it's really important to talk about the relationship between perfectionism and drafting, and this question of how do I know when something's done. And that's something, because I revise so often and over so many years, that I think about a lot. I feel really prepared to talk about. I really admired Bob Dylan at around the same time that I was first drafting this story. And there's this interesting thing that he says about his first album, that he puts it out and he immediately wants to cover his tracks. He wants to move on so that people aren't talking about it anymore. And I think that's one approach to work, to just get out what you have and keep going. And it's an approach I've sometimes taken. I think it's also really important to hold yourself to your own standards, even if those standards are really extreme. And I mean, for me, this story was one that I really liked the premise when I came up with it. I believed in it, and I wanted to grow with it over the years, really stay with it, and and just let it match my vision, even if that vision changed as I grew.
Lovely. Yeah. I mean, I find everyone's revision is so different that I love hearing about the ways in which we think about our poems and stories and essays and everything, because it's one of those things where how do we kind of take our experience and drop it into this piece of writing that we're doing in such a way that makes it interesting and useful for someone else. So thank you so much for joining us this week and sharing parts of your stories. Once again, Ingrid Wenzler for you.
Thank you, Matthew, for having me. I really appreciate it.
Great. Thanks.